In today's video, I'm going to be putting together a badass Trench Crusade Janissary helmet modeled by my friends over at Galactic Armory. Actually, on their Patreon right now, they have multiple helmets available for a contest that they're going to be running, and I have a link down in the description to that. Now, of the helmets that are available, I'm not going to say that this is the easiest one, because I don't think it is. But I will say that I was really happy to take a 3D print and add onto it by adding details like gold leaf and cloth and real feathers, and all of these come together to make one amazing looking piece. So I want to show you what it takes to not only put this together, but to finish it off. Let's go ahead and get started. Galactic Armory has faithfully recreated the Janissary helmet from the concept art in the rulebook. And the nice thing about their Patreon files is that if you have a Bambu X1 Carbon, their prints are already split up across multiple plates. And for this build I decided to go with just some standard gray PLA. Once I had all the individual parts printed out, I could take those up to the shop and it's time to clean and refine. And you gotta admit, one of the most satisfying parts is breaking off the tree supports from the main print. One of the things I like to do for a dry fit is just to use some painter's tape to gently hold everything together. That way I can check fit and see how much material really needs to be removed. One of the tips I picked up from MM's Prop Shop is to use one of these simple and inexpensive foot sanders on exposed edges that are going to be glued. Now for technical refinement, I'll take those parts over to my sanding station, where I'll use my Fordham rotary tool along with several different bits and sanding sponges. A little Bob Smith gel superglue works great to adhere printed parts together. So after a light hand sanding on seams and exposed edges, I can start gluing in the keys for the crown of the helmet. These are going to help everything stay together and line up, and even though there's a small gap visible, I'm going to clean that up later with a little bit of putty. After I go through the dry fitting and sanding process for final assembly, I like to use super glue on one side and then some accelerator on the opposite for a little bit better bond. This makes sure that these seams immediately set and I don't have any issue with the pieces sliding around. I test fit these pieces multiple times because once that accelerator is involved, you pretty much get one chance. Now I will say that this is probably going to be the most difficult part of the build. This 3D wire printed frame was not the easiest to put together. I had a little bit of an issue with the tolerances in between these individual sections, and I had to take away some of the materials so they fit better. And that's okay, because just like any other thing that I do as a maker, when you're putting together model kits, you're going to have to manipulate some of the parts just to make sure that they fit the way they're supposed to. And since there weren't any instructions that I could follow, I'm just trying to go through this build process step by step in my head. For this upper wire cage, I glued it to this inset crown, but I made sure not to attach any of the keys to these parts yet because I want it to be removable to add cloth. The ears were simple enough to glue into place, and I did add a little bit of extra adhesive to the backside at the top for some additional reinforcement. To fill the gaps and seams on this build, I'm going to be using some Dolphin acrylic putty. And the easiest way I've found to apply this is by using some silicone tip tools. And then before the putty has had a chance to cure, I can go in with a hobby knife and remove a bunch of the material so I don't have to sand it later. When I get to the sanding process, most of the putty has been removed, and that way I'm just cleaning up the seam. For some additional reinforcement on this helmet, I like to use a heat tool to melt the interior seams together. Now to prep the printed surface, I'm going to be doing some Rust-Oleum filler and some Krylon red oxide primer. I'm not going to go crazy with this process because I want some of the textures to remain. That way it's not super smooth, and when I add acrylics to this, it's going to grime it up and make it look a little more aged. Now the gold leaf that I decided to use comes in a kit, and I'll put a link for this down in the description section. It comes with a bottle of adhesive, which the gold leaf is going to adhere to, and it also comes with a bottle of varnish. So after the gold leaf is dried for 24 hours, you coat it with the varnish and it gives a nice protective surface. The adhesive for the gold leaf is water-based, and using the supplied brush I can apply it to the surface. One thing you'll notice is that it has a slight bluish tint to it, so you can see exactly where it's been applied. But as the adhesive dries, that'll fade and it will dry clear. The gold leaf itself is extremely thin, and as soon as it hits the adhesive, it immediately wants to stick. Using a chip brush from my shop, I tap the gold leaf onto the surface first to get the majority of it to stick, and then I'll vigorously brush side to side to flatten the sheet and remove excess material. One thing I'll say is that I did have to shut off all my shop fans during this process. Even the slightest breeze coming across the workbench would manipulate the sheet and affect its overall placement. And the other thing I'll say is that this is a messy process, pretty much as bad as dumping a bottle of glitter. I kinda wish that I put down some craft paper beforehand because I feel that I'm gonna find gold flecks for the next 6 months at least in my shop. But I will say that the overall effect and results turned out great, so it might just well be worth it. Now, instead of using the gold leaf, I could have just used some gold metallic spray paint, which I did on the interior because it didn't really need to be gold leaf. But when it comes to projects like this, you can take it however far you want. I just felt that the gold leaf takes it up that extra notch. After the gold leaf adhesive had been allowed to cure for a day, I then went back with a water-based varnish. Now, unlike the adhesive, this did not have any type of a bluish tint to it, so I had to be very mindful of where I had applied it to the helmet. After I'd gone all the way around, this helmet was left to dry for several hours. Now the file comes with a 3D printed wireframe for the top of the helmet, but you still have to cover it with cloth, and luckily I still had some of this really cool heavy textured fabric that I had used for my Warhammer 40k Tech Priest years ago. I had to draft my own template for the cloth cover, and I made it approximately 28.5 inches wide by about 40 inches in length. Now the length was more than I needed, and I removed some of it in the end, but it's always better to have too much than not enough. The 28.5 inches was just enough that I could have a half-inch seam allowance when sewing it together. The fabric could then be turned inside out to hide the seam, and then the cloth could be draped over the printed frame to check for fit. I didn't want it too tight because then I thought it would expose more of the shape of the ribs. To make this helmet actually wearable, I'm going to secure some elastic to the base of the crown piece using some high-temp hot glue. Eventually, some thick upholstery foam will be attached to this, making the helmet comfortable to wear. The cloth covering can now be secured to the base of the frame using some more of that high-temp hot glue from Surebonder. Any excess material can be easily trimmed away before the remaining fabric is rolled under. Now that I'm happy with the fit, I can remove the stitch seam all the way up to the back of the helmet. This will allow the fabric to flow more on the sides. Of course, this fabric is looking way too new, so I need to age it using some Dirty Down dark brown and soot black. These are water-soluble sprays that give it that perfect aged look. And now I can remove excess cloth to get it down to the length that I need. But of course a straight rip looks too far nice and neat, so using some scissors and a wire brush I'm able to fray the edges. This helps it just give a little more visual variety to the overall look. The wire brush was also used to distress the fabric at the top of the helmet as well. And while I'm putting this together, the guys over at Galactic Armory are working on a huge Artilary Witch helmet, so be sure to go check out that build on their channel. The jewels that insert into the helmet's crown were also 3D printed, and their lines are fairly visible. So just like the helmet, I'm going to use more filler and red oxide primer to coat the surface. This will give me a good base surface to remove, starting off with some 220 grit sandpaper. After the majority of the material had been knocked down, I could then switch over to some wet sanding. And at this point, even though it doesn't look like it, that surface is extremely smooth. Using some satin blue spray paint, I coated the jewels, and then finished off the surface with a gloss coating. Before the jewels are glued into place, I want to grime up the gold using some liquitex heavy body, burnt sienna, and Mars black. This acrylic mixture is brushed onto the surface with a mop brush, and the majority of it is removed with a damp paper towel. This process allows the pigment just to remain in the recesses where dirt and grime would build up. And of course you could always add as much or as little as you would like. I actually went back and added more pigments around certain facial features just to make them stand out a little bit more. And as you can see, the acrylics did a great job, taking that surface from the bright, shiny gold to a more aged and weathered metal. The jewels can now be adhered into place using more of that Bob Smith superglue, and here's my first look of seeing the whole helmet together. Since I had decided to use the gold leaf and cloth on this build, I wasn't really digging the 3D printed plume. Now of course you could use this, paint it up, and it'd be fine, but I decided to go with real feathers for this one. To weather the feathers, I'm going to be using a Galactic air compressor as well as their dual action airbrush. Now the feathers themselves were a little too white, so I'm going to use some Monument Hobbies black primer along with a little bit of distilled water. I'm looking for the consistency of skim milk. This will allow me to build up the pigment and tint the feathers rather than coating the entire surface. I end up stacking 3 of the feathers together to give it a decent bulk. And I ended up thinking I could still use part of this 3D print. I marked where it attaches to the back of the helmet and then separated that from the base. Because of the infill, it's going to make the perfect slot to slide the feathers into. So I could then glue that section of the print into place and then spray it with some gold spray paint just to blend in. Then I could fill the infill with more of that high temp hot glue and then push the 3 feathers down into the print. This actually worked great for securing the feathers into place. I can now use my remaining keys to attach the crown cloth section to the base of the helmet. Next up, I created a simple pattern on some Bristol board and then transferred that to some thick upholstery foam. Using more of the hot glue, this upholstery foam could then be attached to the elastic that I had installed earlier. I also cut some strips of 1 inch by 1 inch foam that could be adhered to the sides and the back of the helmet on the interior. Now one of the tricks that I always like to do on my masks and helmets is black out the eyes and the mouth using some black chiffon fabric. This fabric works great because you can see out, but others can't see in. And after the fabric had been cut to approximate size, I then use a low temp hot glue to glue it into place. That way I'm able to use my fingers to press the fabric into the hot glue. After the coverings for the eyes and the mouth had been installed, I could then go in with some small scissors and remove any additional material. And like most props and costumes, it doesn't matter what it looks like on the inside as long as the outside looks great. Hopefully y'all enjoyed seeing how I put this project together. And again, if you want to make your own, Galactic Armory has these available over on their Patreon. I'll put a link down in the description section. And if you are building any of the builds and utilizing some of my tips and tricks, feel free to tag me at SKS Hobbies on Twitter and Instagram. Until next time, have fun building.